Good Sunday morning. I'm Jaden Jefferson, and welcome to this week's Community Focus. We continue to talk about the results of Ohio's primary election, and joining me right now is Dr. Melissa Miller, Professor of Political Science at Bowling Green State University. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Jaden.
Let's kind of just start with this because this was the big race, which was that three-way Senate Republican primary race here. We had Bernie Moreno, Secretary of State Frank LaRose, as well as State Senator Matt Dolan. And we found out that Bernie Moreno won. And he really advertised that Trump endorsement quite often. So what does that mean for Democrats?
Well, it means that the Trump endorsement can win elections here in Ohio, not just for Bernie Moreno in last week's GOP Senate primary, but also 2 years ago when J.D. Vance was running in a multi-candidate GOP primary, and there really wasn't anyone who'd broken away from the pack, and he got endorsed by the former president, Donald Trump. J.D. Vance won that primary and then went on to win in November. So I'm sure that Bernie Moreno is hoping for the same thing to happen this fall.
And what's interesting is that we see across the country in a lot of these different elections, when former President Trump makes an endorsement of these different Republican candidates, they are just skyrocketed to new heights. And so, do you think this is going to be the new trend here in Ohio now?
It may well be, but what remains to be seen is whether or not having Bernie Moreno running for U.S. Senate against the Democratic incumbent Sherrod Brown in 2024, when Donald Trump himself is on the ballot, will manifest any differently this year. One of the things that cannot be ignored is that Donald Trump is involved in multiple civil and criminal cases that pertain to his business practices, that pertain to his attempts to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election and his alleged role in that, as well as the federal documents case. So in the past, right, we have seen that the Trump endorsement is sort of the golden ticket, not just for J.D. Vance in Ohio, maybe for Bernie Moreno this fall, but I do feel like things are new. It's new territory, Jaden, because we've never faced a presidential race like this with one candidate facing multiple indictments and court cases unfolding at the same time that candidate is running for president. So it's really hard to try to predict, for instance, what will be the effect on Bernie Moreno. Hard to say.
And when we talk about that national presidential election, one of the things is it really isn't good for either side because then you have President Biden, who's also facing a lot of criticism and concern due to his age. And so it's like neither of these candidates are exactly going to have an easy way to either being reelected or really just having that position. So kind of talk about President Biden's route to this presidency as well. Could it be possible with the age concerns?
Well, I got to tell you, this is the race that nobody seems to have wanted. It's the race, a rematch between Democrat Joe Biden, Republican Donald Trump. They're both very unpopular and not trying here to equate, each of them have their weaknesses. And they're, in Donald Trump's case, I mean, we can't even really wrap our heads around on what the effect of all of these criminal indictments will be on his campaign because we have no roadmap for that. In the past, we've seen candidates who are thought to be too old to be president overcome that. And the classic case is Ronald Reagan in 1980. And he was only, I believe, in his early 70s. So he was not as old as Joe Biden is now, although don't quote me on Reagan's age, but he really turned that into a plus. I think what we saw and what we've heard from President Biden himself, he's trying to do the same thing, right? He, in the in a public appearance, I'm not sure I'll remember the exact wording, but he said something along the lines of, I'm not the youngest person to ever be president, or, something along those lines, eliciting a chuckle from the audience, sort of a laugh. I mean, he's trying to embrace it, and he's trying to say, with age comes experience, comes wisdom. Whether The Democratic base will buy it, is buying it. The Democratic base is much less concerned about his age. The Republican base isn't probably we're probably not going to vote for him. So what happens to voters in the middle? They're looking at a candidate whose age is higher than anyone who's ever been elected president. And then they're looking at a candidate who faces multiple criminal indictments. So it's really hard to see how this plays out, but each candidate has, a bit of an uphill battle in terms of the factor that could be problematic for them. But I'll say this caveat. I'm pivoting a little bit to talking about Donald Trump. Forgive me because you were asking about Joe Biden, but so far it seems like the lawsuits, the legal cases against Donald Trump have really worked toward his favor. And they've actually, somewhat ironically perhaps, helped him secure the Republican presidential nomination. Not altogether clear whether that will translate to a November victory, in large part because it's a lot easier to convince the Republican base that the lawsuits are what the former president calls a witch hunt. A lot harder to make that case among independent voters.
For sure. And it's interesting because we talk about this race as the race nobody wanted, but yet here we are. This race has happened again. So why do Americans continue to support these candidates even though they don't like them?
Well, I think on the Republican side, the former president is actually, a phenomenon. I mean, he's led a movement. He continues to be at the head of that movement. His base is absolutely loyal to him. And on the Democratic side, I think when an incumbent president, this is true whether that incumbent president is a Democratic Republican, but if that incumbent president signals that they're going to run again, in general, nobody runs against them. And if somebody does, we might think of, for instance, Jimmy Carter, back to that 1980 race, facing a challenge within the Democratic Party from Ted Kennedy. The view is, the conventional wisdom on that is that it weakens that party's chances of winning in November. So we saw Jimmy Carter go on and not, to lose to Reagan in 1980. So I think that, once Biden indicated he was going to run again, the Democratic Party got in line. And yes, there have been some grumbles and so forth, but I think it just speaks to prior experience with challenging an incumbent president. Usually goes badly for the party in November.
And then there's this one other race where we have a candidate who's really popular and then a candidate that's rising in the Republican Party. And I'm talking about the congressional race that's happening between Congresswoman Marcy Captor and State Representative Derek Merrin. And so kind of speak to this because it's interesting. We have a Republican candidate who's a bit younger than Congresswoman Captor is, but Congresswoman Captor has also been serving this community for decades. So talk about how you expect this race to shape out.
I think this will be so interesting. And we've seen Marcy Captor as the longest serving woman in the US Congress, so both House and Senate combined. She enjoys such widespread name recognition, and she's been a popular political figure in Northwest Ohio for decades, really. But we have to keep in mind that in the 2020 census, after the 2020 census, I should say, the congressional districts in Ohio were redrawn. And that's because we lost population and we lost one congressional seat. So of course, the maps had to be redrawn to reduce the number of congressional districts by one. And one of the things that happened is that the 9th congressional district got redrawn and a lot more Republicans were brought into that district. That district is not as blue or as Democratic as it has been in the past. And so in 2022, that was also true. That was the first election during which Marcy Captor had to try to defend her seat in a pretty darn red Republican district. She did so successfully, and she won by, I want to say, maybe 7 points. But here's the thing. J.R. Majewski, the Republican nominee who ran against her in that race, was considered a very weak opponent. And there were a lot of issues with the J.R. Majewski campaign, never run for elected office before. He was known to have been at the U.S. Capitol on the day of the insurrection. As well, it came out that he had misled the public about his service in the U.S. military. And I think the Captor campaign took tremendous advantage of those factors and won pretty handily in 2022. But now with Derek Merrin, we have an experienced politician who's very well known and has held office and represented Lucas County in the Ohio House. He's the former mayor of Waterville, former member of Waterville City Council at a very young age, I might point out. And so I think this is going to be a different ballgame for Marcy Captor, and I think it's going to be a tighter race. There will not be much public polling, if any, so it'll be interesting to see, for instance, whether she debates Derek Merrin, whether we get any signs in terms of fundraising and the like as to which candidate is drawing more support. I do expect both the national Republicans and Democrats will pour a lot of money in this race. Why? Because Captor's seat and Marcy Captor is considered vulnerable. Why? Because the district has become more Republican, and that's the reason. So the Cook Political Report, for instance, has now rated it a toss-up race. And because of that, the Democrats are going to want to hold on to it, expect a lot of national Democratic money to come into this race. The Republicans are going to see this as a possible pickup, a seat that they can flip from blue to red in the House.
Lots of money indeed. Dr. Melissa Miller, professor of political science at Bowling Green State University. Thank you so much for chatting with me.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And that's this week's Community Focus. I'm Jaden Jefferson, and have a great rest of your week.